In this video, we plan to give you an overview of Lesson 4. But before we dive into the details of the lesson itself, we first want to share some important information about how we navigate from one lesson to the next in a way that's coherent from the student's perspective. You may notice that each lesson starts with a short section where students look back to what we learned as a class last time. And each lesson ends by thinking about what questions we think we need to investigate next, and sometimes thinking about how we might do that. You might be wondering, how is using this navigation technique different from how we traditionally introduce a lesson? Or is it really important to take the time to do this? I think the most important difference is that it reminds students not only of what they did last time, but that we are using the ideas that they came up with as a class to continue to move forward. They remembered it was something they wanted to know, rather than something their teacher wants them to learn. Another benefit is that it really helps students who are absent. If a student misses a day, they will still get at least partially caught up by listening to the discussion that occurs during the navigation at the start of the lesson. For example, it is really important that students think about what they learned last time to help them when they decide what data they need to collect to help answer the questions that they came up with. It is also important that students themselves provide some ideas for how they will collect this information. In the last lesson, students had just explored the timeline in the 1918 influenza pandemic and figured out that in 1918, people used some of the same tactics for mitigating the spread of a disease, such as wearing a mask and social distancing. This led them to wonder how people back then figured out those interventions would help, since they did not even know what was causing the virus. Right off the bat in this lesson, students create a list of information they would need to know to understand how they can slow the transmission of a disease. Students first share their ideas with a partner, then create a class list that will help understand what information we need to understand how the disease could be spreading. Students will come up with ideas such as who is infected, what are the symptoms, where have the infected people been, and who have they come in contact with, and what was the nature of that contact. These student ideas lead to the idea of contact tracing. While it is true that we have designed this activity to take place in this time, giving the students the opportunity to identify that they need to know certain information and providing this activity will give them that information gives students ownership of their learning. They decided that they needed this information. We didn't tell them they needed it. In this way, the learning is coherent from the student's point of view and allows them to internalize and intellectual steps that are required to figure out how to answer the question and other questions that they may encounter in their everyday lives.
In an activity at the heart of this lesson, students are playing the part of contact tracers to see what patterns of evidence they can uncover about how a disease spreads and how that spread can be slowed by identifying characters who have been exposed and by having them get tested and quarantined. Students look at cards that contain characters with information about mask wearing, social distancing, type of employment, any contacts if they agree to share that information, and whether they are experiencing any COVID-19 symptoms. They look for patterns in the data across the cards. They use these patterns as evidence for drawing conclusions about how the disease is spread from person to person and ways to slow the spread. While using the character cards information to create a contact tracing map, students begin to notice other patterns that prevent contact tracers from doing their job well. Some characters were unable to be reached, some refused to get tested, while others couldn't quarantine, and some were unwilling to provide personal information to contact tracers. This provides an opportunity for students to think more deeply about the complex social system in which this pandemic is playing out and why some people don't trust organizations and the government with their personal information. In their SEL journals, students choose a prompt to respond to that supports them in reflecting on their experience with the contact tracing activity and how the lack of trust in sharing information with other people, companies, institutions, and governments impacts our ability to slow the spread of the COVID-19 virus. At the end of the lesson, students draw conclusions that wearing masks and social distancing are effective at stopping transmission from person to person. Students have yet to explain how and why these strategies work to slow the spread of a pathogen.